Hello. Before this video begins, I would like to warn you viewers that the Blood and Gore DLC was active in this video, so it may get a bit graphic and brutal. So viewer discretion is advised because it may not be for everyone. I would also like to say that a mod was used during this particular video. The mod is just purely graphical and has no effect on the performance of units. The mod is just to change the helmets used by Greek soldiers. This applies the Corinthian helmets instead of the normal helmets we see in the vanilla game. This is just because I have a personal preference and I like Corinthian helmets better, so I decided to use this mod. If you would like to use this mod too, I highly recommend checking it out. I will leave a link to it in the description below. Now that that's out of the way, we can begin. Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Rome 2 Unfortified Port/Town Defense walkthroughs. In the last episode we reviewed the Romans and the common garrisons that you might have when you are attacked in your town. Today we will be looking at the Greeks. Now, as I mentioned in the last episode, we won't be going over every faction, just one faction that contains the majority of the units contained in the unit rosters of the combined factions. So for example, today we'll be looking at Macedon instead of Macedon, Sparta, Athens, the Seleucids, and all of that because they have very similar rosters and there wouldn't be much difference except graphically. There might be a few other units, but overall it would be the same. So let's get started. Before we actually begin looking at the replays and how I personally use the Greek units to my advantage in defensive battles, I would first like to review the two main units that I usually associate with the Greeks. And that would be the Hoplites and the Pikemen. So first off, we have our Hoplites. They are quite heavily armored most of the time. They have their standard shields and spears. They can form shield wall and are pretty good at holding a position, which makes them useful for guarding those tight corridors when you try to flank around, or when you just need to continue holding. But even better than the Hoplites are the Pikemen. Now the Pikemen are an amazing unit, my personal favorite. This is because they have these long spears, which allows them to easily take out enemies with minimal casualties. So now I'm going to test this out against an AI opponent. And I'm going to form their formations. So the Hoplites can form a hoplite wall, while the Pikemen go into pike formation, pike phalanx. So as you can see, the Pikemen, they have these long spears, which allows them to stop an enemy charge. So if cavalry or infantry are charging, they are easily stopped by the spears. Not only does it slow down enemy movements, but it inflicts heavy damage. So this forces the enemy to either stand in front of these spears or be slashed by them as they charge forth. And this allows pikemen to take very few casualties while inflicting major damage. I've seen a single pikeman unit hold off maybe 5, maybe even 10 units all by themselves in a tight corridor, only because of these spears. As soon as they get out of phalanx formation, they're goners, because although they are heavily trained and armored, these pikes are their best weapon. And the Hoplites, on the other hand, although they can hold, and the spears are also quite useful at stopping the enemy, they don't have as much of a range to stop the enemy by, because, as we'll see shortly, the pikemen, the enemy is forced to charge at them, and even if your pikemen are advancing, you can still do plenty of damage. So now we're going to take on a very heavy melee infantry to see how well the pikemen and hoplites do against them. So now I'm going to skip ahead for when they arrive. Alright, and we're back just before the pikemen arrive, and it took them a while because they're in phalanx formation, which means they walk slowly to remain in this formation. If they were to run, it would have been a bit faster, but they would have been of course, tired. So now let's see how well they engage against very heavy melee infantry.
Pikemen ready for orders.
So normally it'd be best to use pikemen just to have them hold a position and wait for the enemy to charge in. That's when you can do the most damage. But in this situation, seeing the enemy is very unwilling to advance and meet us forth, we're going to have to advance and move in front and meet them where they want us to meet. Which isn't ideal, but we are here just to show off, firstly, on how well these units perform. There we go, the enemy is preparing. Now this is the pikemen's biggest weakness, ranged units. Although they are extremely strong and are probably the best unit at holding their own, ranged units will do the most damage. As you see, they don't have the biggest shields and they don't have really much protection from this ranged attack. So when they're holding a position and trying to stop a huge attack, ranged units can be their biggest weakness because they can easily pick them off without having to worry about these big spears. So basically they get rid of the pikeman's best weapon. So far, it seems like an equal fight. But unfortunately, because of that ranged attack, the pikemen are at a disadvantage early on, in terms of numbers. Now let's speed up time and see how it continues.
The battle is turning in our favor.
Casualties are getting quite heavy on both sides by now. So as you see, the pikemen are doing their purpose. They might not win this engagement, but they are doing what they're supposed to. They're using their big spears to hold off the enemy for as long as possible, buying time for your army to maneuver better, or just to prepare for the next wave.
The men are wavering.
And unfortunately, this time, the pikemen didn't succeed. It may have been because of the early ranged attack, or it may have been because they were facing more experienced and more heavily armored units. Either way, they still did what they were supposed to. Although they didn't achieve victory in this scenario, usually the pikemen are your best option if you want to win a battle. So that's why in my campaigns, whenever I play as Greek factions, I try to have maybe 4 and even 5 pikemen units. I highly recommend getting some ranged units with them so they can assist with taking out the enemy ranged units. Cavalry is also useful for this. So pikemen by themselves, although they are strong, ranged units are their biggest weakness and will stop them with ease. Now let's skip ahead to when the Hoplites arrive in a new scenario. Well, not a new scenario, a fresh enemy unit. Alright, and we're back with the Hoplites now, and they're just about to arrive. We have them in the Hoplite wall formation. Yeah, Hoplite wall formation, which slows them down a lot, but it prepares them, it braces them for any attacks, which is quite useful. So let's see who will win this engagement.
Commander, tribune us!
Now, the Greeks' best chances of victory is when they're just holding still and waiting, so this isn't an ideal situation where they're forced to march into enemy fire and into enemy lines that are prepared for this attack. But they can still be a force to be reckoned with.
Attack them!
Now, what you may have noticed is that by going into the hoplite wall formation, they're more compacted, which makes them... it's harder to miss for the enemy missile units. So although it prepares them better for the attack, it can also be a great flaw. Currently, it seems like the enemy unit is actually doing much better than the hoplites. Let's see how it ends up. Unfortunately, because we were in this formation that kept us in this tight group, the enemy was able to easily surround the hoplites and do plenty of damage that way. I don't think they'll hold out as long as the pikemen did, but they'll still hold out for a good amount of time, which will be plenty to buy your troops extra maneuverability or more time to get prepared.
The men are wavering.
So just as expected, they did much worse than the pikemen did. But then again, we have to remember that in this situation, this was the best enemy unit they had. And the pikemen and hoplites that we sent out in this scenario were pretty early on that you could get. They weren't the best ones you could get, but they weren't the worst ones. They were maybe early to mid-game where you would get them. And this is the best the enemy has to offer. So it is expected that they could win this battle, but it is surprising that our units were able to hold out for so long, which is a great advantage of the Greeks. So now let's go into some battles where I can show you these strategies and how to use these units to maximum efficiency. Well, this may not be fully true, but these are just my opinions and from my experiences. So let's get into it. Alright, so this is the first battle that we are going over. In today's episode, we will be going over two battles. So in this battle, this is quite a simple garrison. It's got one unit of pikemen, 2 units of militia hoplites, 2 mob units, and 2 slingers. Now the cavalry unit, just like in my last episode, is not actually within the battle itself. It's just because this is a custom battle, I wasn't allowed to personally select which unit was the general. Just only a few units have that privilege. And once again, the mob or peasants, or whatever you want to call them, they aren't actually in custom battle, so I just disabled the fire at will and told them to always use their melee weapons. So while the enemy is coming, I'll discuss what I did here. So once again, what you want to do is you want to block off as much as you can. But as you see, there were some other entrances that I didn't really block up. I only focused on one, and that is because of the enemy's position. The AI usually advances and attacks from where they start off in. So if the AI started off here, right ahead of us, I expect the majority, if not all of their forces, to go down through this entrance. Then what I decided to do, since the pikemen are my favorite unit, and in my opinion our strongest unit, I decided to put them right here. Now, I could have put them anywhere here, but I expect the most enemy resistance here because this is the first point and the closest point for them to reach, so they'll probably try to engage here first. But if not, that's why we have those 2 extra units. Now I put my slingers behind my troops so they could have the extra protection, but also so they could fire into the enemy ranks. Preferably, we would prefer to have our slingers be behind the enemy soldiers, or maybe off to the side and not directly in front of them. By being directly in front of them, the enemy has their shields and the most armor to protect them. But from the back and side, they are the most vulnerable. So right now I'm just opening fire and trying to do as much damage as I can before the first charge arrives. But as you see, the enemy ranged units, just like we discussed a bit earlier, are our biggest weakness to our pikemen. Now the purpose of sending those 2 mob units to the left side was just to block it off, just in case the enemy ended up going this way, but it was also so we had an option to flank around the enemy if we thought it was necessary or helpful. But as you see, so far, our pikemen are doing exactly what they're supposed to. They're using their pikes to keep the enemy at bay while also inflicting casualties. Of course, some casualties have been taken because, let's face it, they will die eventually. But the majority of them have been to enemy fire. What you may have also noticed is because the ranged units are the biggest threat to our pikemen, I am focusing my slingers on taking them out. Instead of having my slingers shoot into bunch of shields and helmets, I'm having them shoot into a barely protected bunch of my biggest threat. So although it would help the pikemen hold out here by shooting into this big crowd, because the chances of missing would be much lower, but we will shoot, or at least I will shoot, into the enemy ranged units as soon as possible, so I can do as much damage as possible, so they don't kill as many of our pikemen. And now, seeing as the majority of the enemy force had actually engaged the pikemen and not the hoplites, I decided to send the hoplites up. I sent one unit to help engage from the side, while the other to protect that unit's flank, because I saw a few extra units there that weren't ranged units that could easily charge in and do some good damage to us. I decided to keep them at bay. But seeing as they were not reacting and even facing the other direction, I thought, you know what, let's charge them in. Since they're distracted and not really helping out here, we'll just deal with this much faster. Unfortunately, the enemy fire has started taking its toll. We haven't gone down to 100 soldiers yet, but we're dropping quite quickly. So now what we're trying to do is we're trying to keep the enemy occupied so they either face to our hoplites or they face to our pikemen. By facing to our hoplites, it allows our pikemen to attack the enemy in the side where their shields are not protecting them. By going to the pikemen, it allows our hoplites to do the same. But it is better if they actually go for the pikemen, because the pikemen can keep them at bay and take much less casualties than the hoplites themselves will. But as you see, the pikemen are doing quite well, with plenty of casualties inflicted already, and the battle has just begun. But some of the enemy soldiers do manage to get close, but they are quickly dealt with. And now I see that the majority of the enemy units are either engaged in combat, looking away, or routing. So by that time, I decide to send in my 2 mob units to go and continue moving forth. Now this ensures that we still have this flanking area and maneuverability still available to us, but it also threatens the enemy. It allows us to make these threats that, oh, if you don't watch out, we can easily charge them in and take out your ranged units, or we can attack and hit your strongest units in the back, which will be very damaging not only to their health, but also to their morale. Unfortunately, these pikemen have another flaw, which isn't only to ranged units. They're so amazing at defending that sometimes you get a bit too carried away. Like here, as you see, we have them spread into a very long line, and because the right side of this line has fallen, it allows the enemy to very easily move around us, flank us, and kill us much faster. So the phalanx isn't as powerful as it could be. And as you see, the enemy is getting closer and closer, and the pikemen are beginning to fall much faster. Although, as you see here, they are still putting up a good fight. By now, our slingers have killed the majority of the enemy ranged units. This is extremely helpful. Although they weren't very strong units that could kill us very easily, per se, but to our pikemen and hoplites who are stuck in this position and they can't move anywhere, they were the biggest threat, so I'm glad we got that out of the way for the most part. Now all we have to do is just continue moving forward, and luckily the enemy force is focused on our pikemen, our hoplites. This allows our pikemen to easily attack where the enemy is unprotected. As you see, their shields are facing the hoplites, while the pikemen can easily hit them in the side and back. which is making them very easy targets. Unfortunately, by this time, we have been so focused on taking out the enemy range units, we are almost out of ammunition, which means that unless we just want them to stand on the sideline, we're going to have to engage all of our other units now. And although keeping them on the sideline could be beneficial by keeping our morale raised because we haven't taken that many casualties, it isn't helping because once these 3 units break, if they break, it'll all go downhill extremely quickly. By them charging in right now, they're able to do some damage with these guys, which together is more beneficial. And the enemy actually ends up charging us with their ranged units. So this is a very good opportunity to risk it, to continue engaging them and take out a unit that could be a big threat to our pikemen. Unfortunately, this risk didn't work out for us because the enemy had units on standby that easily charged in and could easily deal with our men. Although they would put up a valiant fight, they aren't prepared enough for victory in those circumstances. And once again, the pikemen, although we did put them into a tighter formation, they have once again spread out under my orders, so we can hit more of them, but unfortunately, they're easily flanking us and taking us down. Don't worry, I won't engage my cavalry, it's just for the morale since the pikeman unit itself is moving up, and I'm predicting that would be the general's unit. So as soon as they back out, I'm backing out the general as well. And I see that I have to act now. I only have 2 hoplite units left, and I'm not sure if my pikemen will come back or not. So I'm forced to engage my 2 slinger units. This is to boost the morale of the hoplites because there's plenty of friendlies around them supporting them, but also to inflict as much damage as we can, because since our pikemen are routing, defeat seems like a very realistic possibility, so we might as well go all in and do as much damage as possible. And luckily, because we're charging in, the sheer numbers and flanking from the side are destroying the enemy's morale. But luckily, the pikemen reorganize and head back in. But I notice that they are exhausted, so I'm going to have them actually walk to the battle. Although we want them there as quickly as possible, if they're too tired, then it's not even worth walking back there or running back there.
Double time!
Or going back there in general.
Engage! Engage! Look forward! Engage! Double time! Happy to serve the people!
So it would be preferable to have them walk, so they still get there, but they rest up a bit more than they would if they were running. But unfortunately, we see that we are starting to take very heavy casualties. Our hoplites are starting to diminish in numbers, and our mob and slingers are beginning to rout. And this is a perfect chance to use the pikemen, because although the pikemen are, in my opinion, the best at holding the line and stopping the enemy while inflicting heavy casualties, they are even better at flanking. Although they are slow with the flanking, if you want them to be rested and ready for the battle, once they get there, they can do heavy damage, because by flanking, the enemy is occupied, and you're easily allowed to just hit them in the back like this, where they're most vulnerable. So combining their most vulnerable weak spot with your strongest unit means absolute chaos and heavy casualties for the enemy. But unfortunately, by now, our hoplites are completely surrounded. The enemy has finished off our mob and is starting to surround us. And I believe, yes, only 1 hoplite unit is still standing. So now it's all up to that 1 hoplite unit and this pikeman unit. But unfortunately, we notice, oh no, the enemy still has 1 ranged unit that has ammunition. At least one unit. And that means they'll be able to easily finish off our pikemen. And then our final unit of hoplite routs. And once that routs, although the pikemen, they are great units, they will have to save their lives at one point. And that's how this battle went. So in this kind of situation, you really have to use the terrain, well, always use the terrain, and your units to the advantage. Block up as many corridors as you can, but only block them up if they are vital and you expect heavy resistance or some resistance at least there. Because if you don't block enough and you expect enemy units to come there, well, they actually might come down there, and guess what? If you don't have anything protecting there, they'll easily march their way down and hit the rest of your units that are busy fighting on the front line in the back. And remember, on the front line, you want your pikemen. They are the best unit you can have. But the pikemen's biggest threat is not infantry or cavalry, but ranged units. So do whatever you can to take out those ranged units if you have pikemen in your garrison. Because those ranged units will be the only thing that can stop your pikemen, other than overwhelming numbers. And even overwhelming numbers will take a very long time to break through. But if possible, and you have multiple pikemen units, I highly recommend leaving some of them, or at least one of them, to guard the main entrance, while having the others, or at least one other, to flank around the enemy, because they'll be so distracted that you can easily hit them in the back, and their morale will diminish, their numbers will diminish, and it'll be a great day for you. Let's move on. Let's see how well the battle went before we move on to the second battle. So our losses were pretty heavy, but the enemy actually lost, I believe, more than half of their men. And we had no friendly fire, while the enemy had some friendly fire. So overall, it was a great day. Now, although we didn't win this battle, as you see, our pikemen got 361 kills. Now that means they were highly effective in this battle. And they probably would have been even more effective if we have taken down the enemy ranged units much faster, which I don't think it was possible in this situation itself to do it much faster. But in other situations, you want to use your cavalry or any units you have to either distract or at least clear off the enemy ranged units. But overall, the pikemen held just as expected. And surprisingly, the weakest hoplite unit that we have, they got some kills, and they held for a very long time as well. Alright, let's move on to the second battle. This battle, I decided to fight against fellow Greeks, because as Greeks, you're very likely to fight or engage in combat against other Greeks. Well, you're certainly going to at least encounter other Greeks, but you're also going to encounter others. So if you move north, you're going to encounter the tribes, which we just saw in the first battle. If you go a bit to the east, or maybe even to the west a bit, you might encounter some other Greeks. So you want to be prepared for any of those situations. So now I'm going to show you how a slightly more armed garrison can also put up a great fight against very similar odds as in the previous battle against fellow Greeks. So right now we're going to be facing Epirus. Now, just because you have pikemen and cavalry, although it's a great combo, victory is not certain. But in this battle, I'll show you how great of a combo they actually can make together. So I set up my men in this way. So I have the pikemen, well, there's only one entrance here, and you always want to set up your forces to block off any of the corridors, but also to protect your vital points, like here. Since this is our only victory point in this map, we're going to try and protect it. Although it is best to keep them off the circle, we'll be fine with it now. So I'm blocking them off here. And although we could hold out in front of this circle, so they couldn't get on the circle, it wouldn't be as good because they could easily flank us. While being with this tight corridor with buildings on both sides, it forces the enemy to come right at us and not able to flank us. Behind my pikemen and hoplites, I have the Turos spears, which are pretty good. They can fight for a good amount of time, and they can shoot at range for some time. Not that long, but they can do some good damage, as you saw here. They very quickly wiped that out and let our cavalry easily finish them off. But now what I'm doing is, seeing as the enemy has actually spread apart their forces, I'm going after their archers, because their archers are, once again, the biggest threat to our pikemen, so we want to deal with them as quickly as possible. And when an opportunity like this is presented, you have to take it. I mean, look at this. Their archers are far away from the main force of hoplites and pikemen, which could easily wreck our cavalry. So, of course we're going to engage them. Now, I continued chasing those archers to give them a bit of more of a scare, so they go further before they start shooting back at us. And then I rejoined here to continue finishing off these archers. So the point of having cavalry, and why cavalry is so good to have in your forces, is because it can very easily take out the biggest threat to your pikemen or other units. It very easily could take out the enemy ranged units. And sometimes if you flank correctly, you can even take out the enemy melee infantry units, or even cavalry units that could be a big threat if they flank you. So cavalry is quite important. Now I've set up my slingers right here in the straight line. This is so we have some distance between the enemy units, but we are still in range and can do plenty of damage. Fortunately, as you see, the enemy archers do get some time to shoot into our pikemen. Luckily, they end up shooting a bit over and into our Taurus spears. And although we want as many men to survive as possible, pikemen, in my opinion, are more important, and it is better to worry about them more. Ooh, an arrow to the head. Or whatever that is. But the AI will sneak up on you. I was so occupied with this battle here and focusing my attention with moving my cavalry, the enemy managed to maneuver around with their hoplites and flank. Luckily, at the last second, I noticed it and was able to move out of the way, but just barely. And this only happened because the enemy hoplites were getting so close I was forced to pull back my cavalry. So you have to be careful of your surroundings. Not only do you want to use the terrain and area to your advantage to give you protection from flanking, but you also want to be careful because the enemy will use it their advantage as well to try and flank you. Unfortunately for us here, the enemy decided to actually engage our hoplites instead of our pikemen, so our pikemen are still an easy target for the enemy archers, while our hoplites are faced with a difficult battle. Luckily, our cavalry managed to flank around. One unit stayed back here, while a second one snuck around because the enemy they weren't in the enemy's line of sight, which allowed them to sneak up and take them out. And as you see, the enemy is actually quite trusting, and as soon as we start backing away, they send their hoplites back into the battle, which allows us to easily come back and take out the archers. And now they've actually begun to engage the pikemen. And as you see, the pikemen are doing as they're supposed to. They're using their spears to their advantage and keeping the enemy at bay while inflicting casualties. Now, of course, you won't always face just militia hoplites, which is the weakest hoplites you can face. But sometimes you might face these normal hoplites, or even shield bearers, or even stronger units by other factions. But the pikemen are always a good solution to them, because it stops the enemy from closing ground and getting close to you. And although the hoplites are strong, I would recommend having a good ratio, maybe 2 or 3 units of hoplites per pikeman unit if you're building up an army. Because although the pikemen are strong, hoplites are more maneuverable and better for assisting and holding the flanks. So the pikemen can continue holding as they do here. And currently what I'm doing is I'm having my slingers maneuver around to shoot the enemy units in the back while they're looking away. They're so occupied with the battle that they aren't focusing on our biggest threat to them as well, which is ranged units and cavalry. Unfortunately, that cavalry unit won't get much action because I wanted to make sure those javelin men don't come back, so because they are ranged units that could inflict some damage. And as you see, so far, the pikemen are holding just as expected. Doing plenty of damage, with little taken in return. And now what I'm doing is a vital part, which is hitting the enemy in the back. Although slingers can do plenty of damage, you need to use everything to your advantage, especially when you see your ranks are starting to get low in numbers. You need to send in your cavalry, because the enemy is looking away. They're busy with the battle, so your cavalry can easily charge in, and like this, rout the enemy forces. Another great use for cavalry. Probably the main use after taking out ranged units. So in these kinds of battles where you have a city or a town and there's this, you notice that one of your victory points is protected or surrounded by buildings. You want to use those buildings to your advantage. They can provide these tighter corridors, which makes it much better for pikemen because it makes the enemy, it lets your pikemen be together and more compacted instead of a long spread out line. And these long spread out lines, as we have noticed in the previous battle and in this one, we can see the left and right side of this line fall much faster than the center, which allows the enemy to flank. So these buildings can be a great advantage to stop the enemy from flanking overall. And even if they do break through the left or right side and not the center, it allows you to continue holding them back because the building is stopping them. And as you see, those cavalry charges made a big difference in this battle. They very quickly routed the enemy units, which could have if we hadn't done that, could have resulted in much higher casualties for us. I'm guessing the enemy still would have fallen, but we would have taken many more casualties because they would have fought for longer. And now the battle is won, but I just decided to continue chasing down to show you the heavy casualties inflicted. As you can see, they were starting all the way back here and they pushed the enemy back this far. And the cavalry charge was very successful with minimal casualties and plenty of damage. And if we look over here, we can see that our slingers did plenty of damage, because if you remember or saw this, you can see that the enemy pikeman unit, or the general's unit, was standing in a straight line like this to stop our cavalry from moving in like behind the main force from here. So our slingers had an easy view of their backs, which allowed a good amount of casualties. So in this battle, the pikemen actually held, and look, there's still 99 of them left, and look how much chaos they have inflicted. And the pikemen had no assistance from cavalry or ranged units. Only the hoplites did. So now let's see how many casualties we inflicted. And look at that. Once again, the pikemen have over 300 casualties. Now the enemy, they got a few hits onto us too, but it's nothing compared to what we did. We massacred their forces, we kept our town, settlement, and we are ready for another attack because we've taken so few casualties that if the enemy was to send another force, we could hold it off once more, or at least put up a good fight. So remember, when there's the city, you want to try to hide between the buildings to allow you to be harder to be flanked. And also try to have cavalry, if possible, to take out the enemy ranged units and hit them in the back as we did. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed this. I also hope this was helpful and useful for you. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you watching the next one. Please remember to like and subscribe, and leave your comments, ideas, and suggestions in the comment section below so I know how I can improve and what you want to see next. Thank you for watching.